With that, I would like to hand the word to Alissa Kleinnijenhuis. She has, with her work and research, together with colleagues at Imperial and Columbia University, really been at the forefront of the underlying research that supports the IDP. Alissa, over to you.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to Frank Elderson, Sabine Mauder, and Professor Johan Rockström for the fantastic remarks that preceded mine. Let me say that I say here to all of those, particularly the remarks by Johan Rockström, that it is absolutely essential to link phase in to phase out, and that there's no realistic hope of staying close to 1.5 degrees unless we implement this rapidly, and that we have a solution and we should get to it. And I also would like to echo the words of Sabine Mauder, who said, 2050 is too far for many actors to take current action seriously. And in a way, I would say, but Johan Rockström can, I'm sure, comment on that better, that the fact that we essentially have no carbon budget left, barring for also negative emissions, means by necessity, if we want to stay close to 1.5 degrees, that all the action has to happen in this very decade, and that's on the plate of current policy makers and current investors. So with that, let me start my presentation. We are here today because we all know the truth. The central challenge is no longer about pledges. It is about credible implementation at scale. And a decisive priority for our global stability is closing the climate finance gap for emerging and developing economies. For years, progress has been stalled. And today I am here to present a new concrete proposal, as per Johan Rockström's remark, let's get to the solution, on how we can work together to break that impasse. And we propose an international decarbonization partnership. It would be a public-private partnership on the need, per Sabine's point, to engage private finance at the right scale, designed to do one thing and to do it at scale, to finance as a starting point whole of country power sector transitions. Let's be candid, our current solutions are not working. This chart shows the hard truth. Over the last 10 years, we have invested nearly $8 trillion in clean power in emerging and developing economies, and yet emissions have still increased. Why? We believe it is for two primary structural reasons. First, there is no link to fossil phase-out. We have been financing individual project-based clean energy, which is good, but it has been completely unlinked to the phasing out of fossil fuels. No coherent country-level transition plans exist to coordinate these transitions. The result? We are building new clean power, but old fossil fuel power plants continue to run, and new fossil power plants are being built. The result is that emissions continue to rise year after year. Second, our financial structuring is inefficient. The cost of capital for clean energy in EMDEs is usually 2 to 3 times higher in high-income countries than in high-income countries. And our public investment, mostly in the form of senior debt, although concessional or small grants, has failed to mobilize private capital. The current leverage ratio is a failure. For every public dollar invested, we are only mobilizing 38 cents of private money. These factors mean that we are underinvesting in clean energy while doing virtually nothing to ensure the fossil fuel phase out that is absolutely critical, because let's be candid, the climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis, primarily. But we can solve this. And we can do it by linking grants with a smarter form of blended finance. This is the very core of the proposed International Decarbonization Partnership, IDP. We propose creating, under the IDP, Individual country transition funds, at least one fund for each EMDE partner nation that is willing to commit to decarbonization, including one focused on the power sector, the lowest hanging fruit with 15 gigatons out of 37 gigatons of global CO2 emission reduction potential. Each fund would be financed by a coalition of high-income countries, and that does not need to include the US, right? And private investors. And it does, for the power sector, two things simultaneously. First, on the left, public grants would be used to pay for the politically hardest part, the phasing out, retiring fossil fuel plants early and funding a just workforce transition. And my research shows that that has an enormous economic return. It's not charity, and it is a lot more safe and foolproof than carbon credits. Second, on the right, blended finance for phase-in. We propose a public investment of approximately 25%, it depends obviously on the de-risking necessity in each country, EMD country, in the form of first loss junior equity. This lowers risk, in turn reducing the cost of capital, and it is thereby designed to crowd in the around 75% of capital from the private sector, precisely as per Sabine's point, because the public sector alone cannot pay for it. But let me make it clear here that having that necessary grant and equity investment by the public sector is necessary to unlock that private finance. This is the capital that builds the new renewables, the storage, and the investable grid extensions. And here is the key that ties it all together. The two pipelines are linked. All financing is tied to verified milestones and emission reductions, which make sure that rich countries are not fearing that their money would be squandered if they pay at the right scale, because any disbursement except the initial batch would be based on actual success in implementing this. The clean power investment and the fossil fuel retirement go hand in hand, ensuring that this time our investments actually reduce emissions and do so at the necessary gigaton scale to take the climate science of Professor Rockström and his colleagues seriously. Finally, it is important to understand that the model of the proposed international decarbonization partnership is designed to ensure energy security in EMDs. Again, per Johan Rockström's point that we need to keep these economies open by building new clean systems faster than old ones are being retired. This is a pro-growth model designed to increase net energy output and help power economic development while we decarbonize. And explicitly, this enables decarbonization while avoiding the trade-off that many of EMDs face that they otherwise have with economic growth. So that trade-off is not there. The proposed plan is not to accomplish this by asking lower income countries to take on more debt, even if concessional, or to ask high-income countries to simply provide conditional grants. The proposed plan is that this is investment. It is not climate aid. A growing body of academic research, including by my own, shows that even if we are pragmatic about which countries are likely to contribute, the cost, meaning the public cost, is actually surprisingly affordable, which matters as per Sabine's point that many countries are already having high debt levels. As power generation technologies are now readily available at scale, we modeled what it would cost if only climate-conscious, high-income countries participated and countries such as the US might not, financing the decarbonization in all emerging economies, excluding China and petrostates that can finance themselves. That cost, we show in our work, would be less than 0.3% of their GDP annually and less than 0.2% if China were to participate in HIC financing coalition. And just places against how much countries are now willing to increase their defense spending. It's not like rich countries cannot afford this. They totally can. It's a matter of whether they will. This is how much it would cost to avoid a climate catastrophe, the thing that Johan Rockström has been talking about in all his work. Again, this is largely investment, not grants or new debt. It is designed to be profitable for both the public and private sectors, for both developing and developed countries. Everyone involved will see strong returns. Our forecasts of our research show that an average internal rate of return of around 8% for public sector junior equity can be achieved, and this is before accounting for the economic gains of avoided climate damages. But when you do include the value of those avoided emissions, we show that the total social and economic return on this public capital is massive, between 9 to 504%. This makes the proposed international decarbonization partnership between developed and developing countries quite simply the highest return public investment of the 21st century. Building on this foundation, we have begun forming partnerships with high and developing countries and implementing partners to establish the International Decarbonization Partnership. The IDP takes the carbon budget as an explicit constraint. In other words, we take the climate science of Johan Rockström and colleagues completely seriously, and we ask not just, let's have more hope, but what does it actually take to implement in accordance with the carbon budget? So we deductively act so that it deductively acts commensurate with the right scale and speed to avoid the approaching climate catastrophe. The IDP can serve as a central coordinating body or a vehicle to build a consensus so that other implementing organizations can take over at the right time. To show that this is doable, we have built a digital energy transition coordination platform capable of helping EMDE governments to plan their own transitions and for financiers to assess their investments and monitor progress through verified emission tracking. In other words, enabling a one-on-one correspondence between a credible implementation plan aligned with the climate science and a credible financing plan that actually enables these countries to implement the transition at the right scale without coming at the cost of their development. Dear guests, decarbonizing EMDE power sectors is the single largest and most cost-effective source of emission reduction available to us, period. Of course, other sectors need to be decarbonized too, but this is the lowest hanging fruit. There is no other way to avoid a climate catastrophe. Without this, we have no chance, only false hope of staying close to 1.5 degrees. But this story is not a story of sacrifice. What we are proposing is a mutually beneficial plan for developed and developing worlds. In other words, for all of us on this planet. This is a plan that finances a transition capable of powering fast-paced development in emerging economies. It enables economic growth, it delivers financial returns to international investors, and it creates widespread economic gains for all of us in this world from reduced climate and health damages. We are here at COP30 because we are, quite frankly, out of time for small incremental solutions. As Professor Johan Rockström says, the only currency that counts in his early work is, speed and scale. And the existing models, including the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, as I'm happy to elaborate on in private conversation, were a good start, but they failed to accomplish either. We need to start coordinating our efforts rather than operating in silos. And we need to directly link the phasing out of clean energy to the phasing in of clean energy to the phasing out of fossil fuels. And we need to use properly structured financial instruments to actually mobilize enough private capital. And we need to do this now because we are out of time. With your help, we can build the International Decarbonization Partnership Coalition to make this a reality. We invite you to join us. Please scan on the screen to learn more, and please get in touch or find Maurice after the session. He can answer your questions. Thank you. Let's have realistic hope and do what it takes now to implement what is necessary to take the best available climate science seriously. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alissa, for this run through of the IDP. A follow-up question to you perhaps is, we've seen that several major mitigation efforts, including JETPs, but also climate funds, but most haven't delivered full country transitions. So in your own words, what's different about the IDP model?
Thank you so much for this question. So for those of you who are familiar or not familiar, let me briefly explain. So there have been in prototype a few examples of deals between a coalition of high-income countries and a few countries that have committed to decarbonizing, including Indonesia, South Africa, and Vietnam, and a few others. But the problem with these JETP, so in principle, these were good ideas, right? So there was high income country coalition of the willing, providing the public capital to crowd in private capital to help these countries accelerate their power sector transition. But there were at least a few problems, and I can later, of course, elaborate more in private conversation. One of them is that the countries did not actually offer climate finance at the right scale. So they offered for, let's say, Indonesia 20 billion, whereas the country itself estimates it needs 100 billion. So essentially, the country does not get the right finance to actually implement what it takes to be consistent with 1.5 degrees. Secondly, the finance that had been provided was not tied to a specific implementation plan, and also it was not tied or made conditional on successful demonstrated emission reduction. So we've talked a lot to EU and other policymakers, and they essentially kind of admit that the reason that they don't dare to pay at the right scale is that they worry that they would squander their money. So as one of our colleagues, Jeremy Zettermeier, says, rich countries are pretending to pay and poor countries are pretending to act, but neither is really doing something. So what we're saying is, in principle, you need to create these funds at the right scale to enact the transition consistent with the carbon budget. But except for the initial disbursement that gets the country started, each next batch of funding that would be released would be made conditional on that country successfully implementing emission reductions through that phase in and phase out of the pipeline. A second problem has been that the type of financing provided was largely concessional loans, which are often crowding out rather than crowding in private capital. And there was hardly any grant financing provided except for 2%, let's say in Indonesia, for technical assistance grants. So in Indonesia, the result is that they are still struggling because they didn't get money to actually pay for phase outs to close their first coal-fired power plant, and they're trying to do it through carbon credits, but that's not easy to raise money in the right amount. And in the meantime, the grid is oversupplied, so they cannot actually add renewables unless they close coal first, but they haven't paid for that. So they're stuck in a bottleneck type of barrier. So what you need, and rich countries think that if they pay grants, that they give away money, and they like to pay loans because then they somehow think they get their money back. Whereas what we show in our research is that actually if they pay grants and catalytic capital, that is, let's say, a junior equity stake, it's not give away money. It has an enormous social economic return that is absolutely in their own economic interest. And the final thing I would say is that the finance that has been provided often in a very uncoordinated way. So let's take South Africa as an example. Here, the European Investment Bank has been the one that was providing the loan of the EU. Again, concessional loan, not catalytic capital, not grants. And they provided this loan for a whole host of things, including electric vehicle charging stations and so on and so forth. But they didn't actually tie that finance to a credible and cohesive phase out and phase in plan. And there was no grant funding provided to close coal properly. So as a result, South Africa is now saying, if we are to close this coal plant, we have no plan in place to make sure that we have energy security because it's not tied, right? Phase out and phase in are not tied. And they haven't actually got the money to close that plant first, so they're not really willing to. So all of this is to say that if you do not, oftentimes people think, oh, we do like a half effort, right? We kind of provide money, but not at the right scale. We kind of provide money, but not in the right type. But when you do a half effort, you run into bottlenecks. And so what we are saying is this is totally doable. We know how to do it. We take a country's current energy mix. We take the NGFS scenarios of how emissions need to be reduced to be consistent with the carbon budget. We take NGFS scenarios of projected energy demand. Country can update it if they have something better. We can form a phase-out pipeline of which fossil fuel assets to close when. We can form a phase-in pipeline of which renewable assets to introduce when and where to make sure we don't have an energy shortage and we keep up with growing energy demand. And we actually link finance one-on-one with the implementation plan. And that's obviously absolutely necessary because you cannot close a plant of coal unless you know what to build in its place. Otherwise, you have an energy security issue. You cannot build renewables unless you can connect to the grid. You cannot do all of this unless you have actually the right finance. So this is all to say that we can do it. Let's have hope, but we need to focus not on more talk, but on implementation. And for that reason, we invite everyone that is listening to this to join us in this partnership that we are seeking to establish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alissa.